My text this morning will be found in the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. However, I would like to, before beginning that reading, review some information to be found in the book of Acts chapter 17. I enjoy when I'm studying a book in the New Testament, one of the church letters, such as Philippians, Colossians, and now Thessalonians, going to the book of Acts and reading the history of the beginning of that church, how it began, what circumstances were involved. We read earlier in the book of Acts chapter 16, Paul is in Antioch and begins traveling. Antioch would be, if you think about the Mediterranean Sea, he's in the northeastern corner. Antioch would be located up in the northeastern corner of the landmass around the Mediterranean Sea. He begins traveling in a northwesterly direction. In a recent stream message, I said northeasterly, and my directions were reversed. When I'm tired, I misstate sometimes, my human frailty. He travels in a northwesterly direction. He's probably in central Turkey as we know it today. He's looking for places to evangelize, to preach, and he thinks about going here, there, and other places. And there's this conviction. The Lord is saying, no, Paul, that's not where I want you to be. And during a night, the Lord appeared to him, and he appeared in the form of a vision. A man dressed in Grecian attire said, come over into Macedonia and help us. He's in the middle of Turkey, and he doesn't have jet planes or automobiles or trains. He walks probably the greater part of that distance. He has a long time to think about where he's going, but he doesn't stop till he reaches Philippi, and he preaches. And he doesn't find a mega church when he arrives. He finds a small band of Jewish women who meet by a riverside on the Sabbath day. The tradition of the Jews in the first century, when Jewish people traveled in business and settled in a location, until they had a group of 10 plus people to regularly meet and support their worship effort, and they would form a synagogue. Prior to that, they would meet on the Sabbath day, they would fellowship, they would read the scriptures, they would pray. The description in Acts 16 of this place where these handful of Jewish women met was a place where prayer was wont to be made. Paul meets them there. How did he discover it? In a city of Philippi? We're not told, but he was searching for the right thing, and he found it. And he meets with them on the Sabbath day. He preaches Jesus. And Lydia, one of those women, is blessed. Her heart is open. She rejoices at what he preaches and is baptized and says, if you respect me, let me be your host. Come live in the house where I am. And they kept preaching, and too many people caught the attention, and they ended up being thrown in jail and mistreated and maligned, even though Paul himself is a Roman citizen and should be, by his citizenship, immune from such treatment. Well, they're released from jail, and Paul protests his Roman citizenship, and the authorities in Philippi are quite eager to say, please leave and let's not talk about this anymore. We're sorry, all of those nice things. After Philippi, here we go in Acts 17, and Thessalonica becomes the subject. Acts 17, verse 1, and reading down a few verses. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. So it's a larger group of Jews, 10 plus. We don't know how large, but at least enough to have a formal synagogue. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus, whom I preach unto you, is Christ. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. So Paul, on 3 consecutive Sabbath days, reasons with the Jewish people in the synagogue. Some of them believe. And he's obviously not sitting around twiddling his thumbs during the week. He's preaching, teaching in whatever way he can find people to listen. And a large number of Greeks, non-Jews, Grecian people, natives of the area, are converted, and important, influential women, not a few, are all converted. How does this go over in the community? But the Jews which believed not moved with envy. Envy means I would like to have what you have and be able to do what you do, but I'm not willing to pay the price that you pay for it. That's envy, isn't it? I want it, but I'm not willing to pay the price for it. Moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. When they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also. Boys, I remember a preacher who was a native of Birmingham, same as you, Elder T.E. Majors. You might remember that name from your early years. He was up in the state of Virginia, pastoring a church in Front Royal, a gracious and hospitable man. I loved the time I spent with him. He preached a sermon on this passage, and his primary point was they turned the world upside down to get it up right side up. It was the wrong way. They needed to turn it upside down to get it right side up. Good point. Whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. And they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And when they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. And the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. And they were treated better by the people in the Jewish synagogue in Berea, the noble Bereans who searched the scriptures when Paul and Silas preached to them. So you have this background. Paul and Silas remained in Thessalonica a rather short time. They have established a church. These people in the Thessalonian church are new Christians. They're not seasoned, old salts, old professionals. They're new and green and novice Christians, but they're a church, and they're zealous, and they're eager to learn more and to be established in the faith. And I believe Paul is writing primarily to do just that with them. They need to be reinforced and encouraged in their faith and their godly conduct. They need to be taught clearly anything in the truth of the gospel that they may not have fully understood. There's at least one point regarding the second coming we'll see in chapter 3 that they did not understand, and Paul clarified the point for them. They probably understood the criticism of those who assaulted them that I read about in Acts 17. But when influential people say bad things about you, someone wonders, someone listens, someone says, well, that wasn't my impression, but maybe that person's right. And so there's a little doubt planted in some minds. Paul does not become very focused and intense in his defense of assaults against him the way he does, for example, in Galatians. But he does, to a certain extent, in these first 12 verses of chapter 2, there's a certain touch of defensiveness. But even as he defends himself, he is affirming these people in their faith. He can do both at the same time. If we look at the negative side, and I don't like to focus on the negative, so I'll try to focus much more on the positive this morning. But if we look at the negative side, from what we learn in these first few verses of chapter 2, false teachers are motivated by four major attitudes and behaviors. And they probably used all four of these to attack Paul and to raise doubts about him to try to undermine his influence. Verse 3, trickery. Any device, any strategy to manipulate others and gain personal benefit to self. Flattery, ditto, the same thing. You folks are the most sincere people in the world, but don't you understand this Paul is not nearly as sincere as you think he is? That's flattery, trying to build these people up and pump up their ego at the same time tearing down someone else. When someone builds you up to tear another person down, walk away. Because when you're not around, they'll tear you down to build someone else up. That's not a good character trait. Verse 5 was flattery. Verse 5 also identifies greed. Greed can relate to money, or it can relate to anything else relative to ego that gains for self. It doesn't have to be money. And finally, verse 6, praise from men. Paul then, in verses 7 and 8, goes to the other side and identifies the motivation and the attitude and disposition and conduct of faithful teachers. They tenderly address the needs of others. They employ a loving and gentle spirit, like a nurse or a nanny caring for a very small child. You care for that child with love and with soft, tender words and actions. You endear that child to you, and you, in process, you endear yourself in your heart toward the child. Paul even uses that analogy as he describes this faithful disposition toward preaching and teaching the Lord's people. There is no room in that gentle, caring spirit for flattery or for any form of manipulating people for personal gain. It contradicts everything about what Paul is teaching here. So we start with that background in chapter 2, verse 1. We'll go about a verse or two at a time as we go through the first, hopefully, 12 verses this morning. For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain. But even after that we had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. Paul preached, he followed his guidance from the middle of Turkey to Philippi. He established a church that started with a handful of Jewish women meeting by the riverside. And then he was beaten, thrown in jail, and once discovered his Roman citizenship, he was released. He goes to Thessalonica and gets almost the same treatment. If he'd stayed around, he would have had it and worse. So he says, brethren, you know the entrance I had. You know how I came, and you know all of the details about things that went on in my time with you. But understand, my friends, my time with you was not in vain. God is bigger than persecution and persecutors. God is bigger than difficulties that unbelieving men throw at you. And God blessed my time with you. You are the best witnesses to that reality that could be named. Not in vain. It accomplished something. It did something really good and worthwhile. We were bold in our God. He wasn't, after the Philippian experience, if you were preaching the gospel and really living your faith, and you got beaten and thrown in jail for it, how would you react when you were released tomorrow morning? Oh, it's just not right. This persecution, it's just not right. And you'd be cranky and dejected, right? I probably would too. What about Paul? Got another golden opportunity to preach the gospel. Let's go, man. Get on your horse and let's ride out of town and go preach. I spent the last 20 years of my business career in the insurance business. Now, you think about someone whose training, whose professional experience through his entire career has been accounting, going into insurance. What was I thinking? And the man who supported me in that transition was a very helpful man. I could have never done it without his help. He wanted me to get into life insurance, selling life insurance to people, individuals, because that's where he made his mark. I wanted group medical. That was what I knew. That's what I wanted to get into. So I go one direction, he wants me to go the other. Every pep talk George gave me was about life insurance and talking to people. And he gave me the warning every time. Joe, don't worry about, when you talk to someone about life insurance, don't worry about someone saying no. Every person that tells you no gets you closer to the person who says yes. Well, if you're going to sell life insurance, that's the best attitude to have, but that wasn't my forte. Well, Paul takes that attitude here. He is so absorbed and immersed and excited and convicted about the gospel he preaches that he doesn't hear the no's, he keeps preaching to hear the yes and the encouragement. Despite all the persecution, despite all the troubles he had, he was focused on the gospel. I'll be 80 next month. Who am I talking about? It doesn't seem like it's me. But I have to tell you, in my almost 80 years, I have never seen or experienced anything like we have lived through in the last 15 months. I never have. My mother lived through the Spanish flu in the 1919s or 19 teens, and actually helped many families in the community where she lived, and sometimes helped their sick members recover, and sometimes helped the families bury their dead. And all that helped. She didn't catch it. And she told stories about her experiences when I was a child, but I didn't live through it. And that was something in another time and another age. It's been something of an ordeal, has it not? And yet it could have been so much worse. There were churches, many, many churches in this country during that flu pandemic. It's a name I hadn't heard before 15 months ago, that didn't meet for 2 years or more because of the contagious disposition of the flu. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't have Zoom to continue hearing men preach and continue some degree of communication and fellowship. They were all alone. So we didn't have it nearly as bad as we perhaps might think we did, or certainly as we could have. But we can say to ourselves, we really had it bad. We had a tough time. Where's your focus been for the last 15 months? Has it been focused tightly on Jesus, and have we refused to be deterred or distracted from our focus on Jesus and Jesus only, or have we been distracted to other things? Paul refused to be led into a detour. Wouldn't let it happen. He was bold, he says. There was no constraint or reservation about his preaching. In my streaming my messages, I talk much more calmly than I do here. Did you notice that over the last year? And when a good preacher's wife is worth $1 million plus, to the preacher and to the church he served, by the way, and I count Sandra as the best. She had heard me through the year plus, and we announced that we were going to start meeting again. She said, now, Joe, you can't go to church and stand in the pulpit and lecture. They're going to expect more than that. I said, don't worry about it. You see, I've talked with preachers who spend their whole preaching hour looking at the ceiling, looking at the wall, the clock, looking out the windows, looking at the floor, never making eye contact with the people they're preaching to. They rob themselves of a blessing. I want eye contact with you when I'm preaching to you. You feed me by your zeal and your understanding and reception of what I'm preaching. And that feeds my enthusiasm, and my zeal is stronger when I see your response to my preaching than when I don't. God bless you. Thank you for that responsiveness. Makes me a little, makes me a little bolder in my preaching, and I hope it's well received. Paul was not preaching Paul's philosophy. He was not preaching Paul's ideas, opinions, or wishes. He was preaching the gospel of God. That gospel he preached was of divine origin. It came from God. Whether we live and attend church and fill the pulpit or fill the pew, our task from God is to live the gospel that we hear preached with our mouths and with our feet. And that's just as incumbent on people in the pew as it is on the man in the pulpit. We represent our faith wherever we go, on the job, in our neighborhood, with our families. We represent our faith. Do we represent it well, or do we disappoint it? He said, I preached unto you the gospel of God with much contention. What Paul is describing here is not contentious preaching. Nitpicky, hammering. One of Sandra's cautions to me is, when I'm preaching, I'll do this because I'm making points. And in my mind, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And Sandra says, Joe, it sounds like and it looks like you're being preachy, and you're bossing those people and telling them what they have. Don't point so much. That would be contentious preaching. You understand. What Paul is saying is that he preached. For Paul preaching, his preaching was an intense struggle. He was struggling to convey to the minds and the heart and the conviction and the faith of the people who heard him the truth that he believed, and so found deliverance and freedom from his old slavery in believing and preaching. A good way to remember the right disposition and to be strong in our faith, but kind and gracious in our manner. Our task in preaching and teaching people who are not familiar with our faith is never to win an argument. It's always to win the person. There's a difference. You can win an argument and convince a person against his will, he'll never change. But if you convince the person of your authenticity and the depth and conviction and sincerity of your faith, and they can see it affirmed in Scripture, you might have a shot at winning the person. And that's what our goal should always be. Clock's going too fast. Verses 3 and 4, for our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile, but as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. Our exhortation. This is a compound Greek word. It was translated from a compound Greek word, parakaleo. What's a paramedical or a paralegal? You're a paralegal, aren't you? What do? You work alongside attorneys. You work with them. You support them. Sometimes you do the work they're supposed to do because you're good at your job. Yes, but the idea is to work alongside and to help and assist. You have to know a lot, sometimes about as much as they know, to fulfill your job. To call alongside is what this word means that Paul uses. Paul could not call people alongside him if he was not preaching the same gospel with his feet he was preaching with his mouth. And he did that. Yes, it's a persuasive discourse. He's trying to be as persuasive as possible. But he's preaching two sermons at the same time, one with his mouth, the other with his feet. It was not, and Paul uses several very negative terms. I referenced them in the beginning. It was not of deceit. He didn't preach error. He didn't preach deceivingly, saying, I believe this, but I want you to think I believe that. Years and years ago, I was actually friends with a man who began to change his beliefs. Now, a person can change their beliefs, okay, but be honest about your change of belief if you do. This man was changing. He was a primitive Baptist. He was changing his beliefs about essential doctrine. And he completely redefined the word predestinated in Romans 8:29 and 30. I mean, he completely redefined the word. Has nothing to do with eternity at all. Everything has to do with here in time. And I was trying to reason with him. And we were talking on the phone one day, and he made the statement, well, Joe, I was up at, he named a church in Northern California, and Deacon so-and-so, who's been a primitive Baptist all his life, and he's in his 70s now. And he came up to me after I preached, and he said, brother, that was the same preaching I heard when I was a young man in the church. And I asked him this question, tell me, did he understand what you believe? Or did he think you were preaching something different from what you believe because of the way you explained it? He laughed and congratulated himself that he had actually deceived the man and was happy that he had. At that point, our friendship pretty much ended. If a man from the pulpit can't be honest, he needs to get out of the pulpit. You may not preach in the pulpit what I believe, but I will respect your honesty if you are honest. I've talked about preachers from other denominations that I periodically quote from them because I believe, despite our theological differences, they're honest men and they truly believe what they preach. God bless them. We're all going to have a little conversion when we get to glory, and we're all going to believe the same thing after we arrive. So let's not beat up on each other too much while we're here. It was not of uncleanness. It's easy. These are lewd fellows who are accusing Paul and Silas. So they're going to accuse Paul and Silas of lewd conduct. I mean, as a man thinketh, so is he. So he speaks from the abundance of his heart, Jesus himself says. And so a lewd fellow is going to say, when he criticizes you, you're a lewd fellow too. Paul says, no, our feet prove that we are not of this character. The gospel imposes and requires godly integrity in the lives of those who preach it and live it. When Paul assured Timothy that despite false teachers regarding the resurrection, the Lord still knew his own and they were secure in him, he said, let everyone who names the name of Christ do what? depart from iniquity. And John says in 1 John 3, every man that hath this hope, the hope of resurrection in him, purifieth himself, even as he is pure. And finally, Paul says our preaching was not in guile. This is fraud, underhanded, and misleading. The best analogy I can give you is a fisherman line fishing, with a hook and bait. You put bait on the hook to look like the normal food that fish eats. And you make it look just as appealing. If you were the fish and you like, let's say, filet mignon, somebody doesn't. I tried to pick a good one, Katie. How can you not like it, right? If the fisherman wanted to get my attention, he would put something that looked like a prime filet mignon cooked just right with all the trimmings on the hook for me. And what do I want to do? Get it, eat it, gobble it up. But what happens the minute I close my mouth, I feel the hook. You're caught. It's deceit, and it's deceit intended to capture and control other people. You see, Paul's preaching was not to capture and control people and manipulate them to do what Paul wanted. It was to win followers to the Lord Jesus Christ. There's a difference, a big one. I love verse 4. It's been one of my favorite verses in 1 Thessalonians for decades. As we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. Allowed and trieth actually is translated from the same Greek word. To be put to the test and found to be valid. It's like testing a piece of metal to know what alloy it is, what kind of metal and how it's been alloyed. So you know what it is and how you can use it to most advantage. Tested and approved is probably one of the best simple definitions you could make. This is God's good housekeeping seal, if you want to put it that way, for Paul and what he preached. He wasn't trying to win the largest number of people or gain the greatest popularity. He says he was striving to please God, who is the one who tries the hearts of his people. There are some, I told Stephen a few months ago, I keep thinking that sooner or later I'm going to preach a series of sermons on biblical texts that are most misrepresented or misunderstood. Galatians 1:10 has to be one of those. 99% of the time when someone quotes this part of our Galatians 1:10, they'll quote it this way. For if I yet please man, I am not the servant of Christ. No, that's not what Paul wrote. Let's read the whole verse. And Paul here is in intense defensiveness against those who were accusing him in Galatia. For do I now persuade men or God? Am I trying to persuade God to agree with the gospel I preach? Don't think God's going to change his mind. Paul's job is to persuade men, right? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. I have no business claiming to be Jesus' servant when pleasing men is my real heart motive. Paul didn't say, if I yet please men, I cannot be the servant of Christ. That's a truth. That's the way it's usually quoted. But Paul said, I should not be. Don't claim to be what you're not. And if you're trying to please men and preach what makes them happy, don't claim to be the servant of Christ. God is the one who judges our hearts. This is a touchy point, but it's one that is really important here. God who tries the hearts. God alone can judge my motives for what I do. God alone can judge your motives for what you do. Beware and avoid anyone who says, well, I know why you did what you did. Only he won't say, I know you did. He'll talk to someone else and say, I know why he did what he did. And they will always impute to you an ulterior motive, never a good motive. How do they know that? Let me suggest that when someone regularly accuses other people of an ulterior motive, they are telling you more about themselves than they are about the person they're accusing. And Jesus himself is my authority. Matthew 12:34, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. They're telling you about themselves, not about this other person they're criticizing. How emphatic is this? There's a passage in Hosea, chapter 10, verse 4, that talks about this deceitful motive in behavior. They have spoken words swearing falsely in making a covenant. This is serious business. They're engaging or entering into a covenant, but they were false in their pretense and claims from the very beginning. It's a false covenant. Thus judgment springeth up as hemlock in the furrows of the field. What's hemlock? It's poison. There was some Greek, was it a Greek philosopher who drank hemlock and used it to commit suicide? Socrates, thank you. All right. This is supposed to be an amenable, constructive, beneficial covenant. But because it is based on false pretense, it becomes poison, deadly poison in the furrows of the field that's supposed to feed you. Do I have to say the Lord doesn't want his people to follow that example? For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. Oh, there's so much here, so much, and so important. I've made the statement, I believe it profoundly. My job, if we had the best preachers in our faith here today, and we were patient enough to hear every one of them preach a sermon, when my time comes, my job is not to try to outpreach one of them. Oh, you know what my job is? My one divine assignment, try to preach better than I preached last time I preached. And every time I get in the pulpit, whether there's another preacher in 100 miles or not, my job is to preach better than I did last time. I'm my own competitor, and any competition beyond that's not good competition. Tom Constable, I said I quote people whom I believe to be sincere when they give good thoughts and insights. I quote him rather frequently. On this cloak of covetousness, he describes the meaning of this term as self-seeking in all its forms. Covetousness you desire for yourself, not for the benefit of others. Nor of men sought we glory. John in the Gospel, chapter 12, verse 43, talks about some people in the Jewish establishment who believed in Jesus, but they refused to acknowledge him, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. I'm going to short circuit a bit because there's one point I want to punctuate in this message. Let me just read down verse 7 and reading down. But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherishes her children. That's the gospel ministry when it shines the way God intends it to be. A gentle nurse, gently teaching, gently helping, never cajoling or manipulating or orchestrating people. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. You're witnesses. And God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. As ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father doth his children. Good text for Father's Day, isn't it? Verse 12. That ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory. If I approached any one of you and asked you the question, can you walk worthy of God? I suspect most of you would very quickly start telling me why you can't and why it's impossible for you to do so. But Paul didn't name an impossibility. He gave an exhortation that tells us we should walk worthy of God and that he has called us to do that. How can we, as his people, walk worthy of God? You ready for this one? Well, first of all, Paul did write that you can, so don't say you can't. Go to work. The first thing we have to do, the first thing, is get self out of the way. That thing called self will raise its ugly head every time we try really hard to get out of our shadow and to honor God. And if you want to please and walk worthy of God, you have to get self under control and out of the way. Secondly, focus on others, not on yourself. Preachers turn into cold sweat when someone says, we need to have a business meeting in the church. You know why? Because when someone wants to have a business meeting in the church, someone in the church wants to push his idea, not encourage the church to do what everyone else thinks. Right? I'm just trying to be honest with you, right? And there are times when there's business that needs to be done, but are we going to into the business meeting bound and determined, I'm going to get my way or else? There's been too many of those meetings, and they last about 10 times longer than they need to. If we go into a business meeting with Philippians 2:3 as our guiding principle, that business meeting will be over in about 5 or 10 minutes, and everybody will love each other and go home happy. Somebody's trying to get their way, it'll go on and on and on and on into the sunset. And people will go home miffed. Right? There's a simple way, and Peter tells us how, in simple terms, we can walk worthy of God. I have to short circuit this, but I have to cover it. I need to cover it. 2 Peter chapter 1. I'm going to start with verse 2 and read into it. Grace and peace be multiplied unto you through the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord. You grow in grace and peace the more you know about Jesus. You can't ignore the Bible and find peace in your faith. You can't. Ignore the Bible and you'll be cranky. Put a lot of time in your Bible and you'll be peaceful. According as his divine power hath given unto us all things that pertain unto life and godliness. Whatever you and I need to serve God today, he's given it to us. Life, how you're living your life. Godliness, godly conduct. Through the knowledge, back to the emphasis on knowledge, not through your goodwill or your own determined will, but through the knowledge of him that hath called us to glory and virtue, whereby by his calling and by our gaining knowledge of him are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers, literally participants of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. This is not eternal salvation. This is something that's going on in the godly behavior's life right now. And he's not finished. And beside this, you're not finished when you get to that point. I thought I'd arrived when I got there. Preacher, no, you're just beginning. That's the foundation. Beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith. You have faith. He's writing to saved people already. Add to your faith. You have faith. Now let's make it fruitful. Add to it virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. 7 things that we need to add to our faith. For if these things be in you and abound, they make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But he that lacketh these things is blind and cannot see afar off, and hath forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. You want your faith to be fruitful? That's the way to walk worthy of God. That's the way to participate, to become a sharer in conduct and lifestyle of that divine nature that resides within you as a child of God. We've got our assignment. Now our task is to go to work and put it in practice with each other and with the people we meet every day. God bless.